Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Claire, and I'll be the librarian host this afternoon. This seminar series is offered through the NOAA Central Library Seminar Program, which provides an educational forum for the presentation of ideas, research updates, and news in support of NOAA's mission. We're excited to be hosting another in this series for the Weather Program Office today. Before we start, I have a few technical tips for attendees. You are muted and you are not able to unmute. However, if you have a question, you can type it into the question or chat panel and we will get to those during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. If you have any audio visual issues, if you can't hear the speaker or see the slides, please try logging off and back on. That solves most issues in GoToWebinar. As a reminder, this is being recorded. If you'd like to revisit this seminar or view previous seminars, you can find them on our YouTube channel, and I can place the link to that in the chat box momentarily. Now I'm going to turn it over to Gina, who's going to introduce our speakers today.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us again. Some of you perhaps for the first time, and some of you what I hope is for the third week in a row. And so some of you have heard this introduction, but for those who are new, it's worthy of repeating. Today is part of sort of a broader effort, and it relates to some of our policies and laws that influence the Weather Program Office. For example, the Weather Research and Forecast Innovation Act of 2017 requires NOAA to prioritize research that improves forecasts and warnings for the protection of life, property, and the enhancement of the national economy. Specifically in this law, Section 104 of the Weather Act, as well as the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018, otherwise known as what we call the Disaster Supplemental Appropriations, provides NOAA with a really unique, important opportunity to integrate the social, behavioral, and economic sciences into NOAA's tropical products, information, and services, and incorporate risk communication research into the design and communication of those products. The Weather Program Office worked side by side, truly in tandem with our National Weather Service partners to fund 4 projects to reach these very big goals. Today's webinar is the third of a 4-part series to highlight this important work. We hope that all of you listening today will join us one last time next Wednesday at noon for the conclusion of this series. These projects in today's webinar would not be possible without a team, and as such, I'd like to publicly thank the NOAA Central Library, who's just an amazing partner for hosting these webinars. And of course, the National Weather Service, including Jennifer Sprague-Hildebrand, Jessica Schauer, Robbie Berg, and the entire Tropical Roadmap team, as well as Mickey Olson and Castle Williams from the Weather Program Office for all of their time and commitment to advancing social science R2O. And of course, we can't do any of this without our academic partners involved in these projects, including today's presenters. And so with that, we are so very excited to introduce Dr. Robert Soden and Dr. Scott Miles, whose project was funded under this supplemental disaster funding. Using a combination of different methods, these are very different than the previous 2 webinars, which is really exciting. They're going to be using a combination of user-centered and usability study approaches. This project will help NOAA determine how to modernize its hurricane web presence. And so again, open your minds for learning very new sort of social science approaches here today. So Dr. Soden and Dr. Miles, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much for that introduction. My name is Robert Soden. I'll be leading the presentation today, but Scott is here, and I've asked him to kind of just feel free to jump in whenever he sees fit, make it a little bit more conversational. Quick background on myself. I'm a assistant professor in computer science in the School of the Environment at University of Toronto, and a lot of my work, as you just heard, is about using human-centered and user-centered design research to improve the information systems that we use to understand and respond to the threat of disaster. So I've worked a lot in the past on things like floods, earthquakes, and this has been a really fun project. The kind of work that we're doing here around hurricanes is sort of a new hazard to me, so I've had to learn a lot, and it's been quite exciting, and we're happy to share the work with you today. So this is really a 2-year project. again, using human-centered design with the goal of helping the National Hurricane Center sort of update and modernize their web presence with a particular, focus on reaching the public. You see the current version of the site there on the right. If you type in hurricanes.gov, that's what you'll find. It's in the off season right now, so it has a little bit of a different appearance. But I think from the start, there's kind of two key points that I want to make about this site. And in order that, first off, to date, the target audience for this website and for the NHC's web presence overall has largely been core partners within the weather community and emergency response entities, as well as other parts of kind of federal, state, and local gov. However, this is changing, thanks to social media and other factors. An increasingly large percentage of the people that end up on this website are not part of these kind of historic kind of focus groups for the website, but rather members of the general public who have different levels of expertise, different sorts of questions about hurricane risk that they have when they come to the site, and so on. And so historically, the site has been largely again focused on sort of these expert communities amongst the core partners, and really a big part of our mandate for this work was to help NOAA and NHC think through some of the opportunities and implications of maybe pivoting slightly to focus more directly on the public as well. There's really, I think, three principles that are driving our approach. First, again, sort of this need to meet the very different uses and needs of the public. Second is how can we sort of take some of best practices of user experience design that have already been sorted out in other sorts of domains and other contexts, and really bring them here for some actionable and useful recommendations. And then finally, how do we draw on some of the just really vast quantities of good research in the field of weather and tropical storm risk communication to inform our own work. And those have been some of the kind of guiding principles. Our hope is at the end of this is to develop really and deliver kind of a wide range of recommendations. Everything from kind of some very simple, low cost, kind of no regrets design ideas that could be implemented now without too much trouble or really external assistance by the National Hurricane Center team, to some ideas on process changes around how the site is incorporated into the overall communication strategy of the center, as well as some opportunities for future research and some places to go deeper. But notably, this is not like a website redesign project where we're going to come back with kind of a set of detailed mock-ups that can then be contracted out to be implemented. The Hurricane Center and NOAA came to us with some much more kind of fundamental questions about how they should think about the role of the site in relation to the public, in relation to their overall risk communication strategy, in relation to the ecosystem of other kind of organizations and tools that are out there that present similar or complementary kinds of information. And ultimately, our goal is to really sort of provide a foundation for NOAA hurricane products and services to be more accessible, usable, and useful to the public, and provide a little bit of some guidance that can then be taken forward. You heard us talk a little bit about human-centered design, user-centered design. I'm not going to try and define that right now. You'll kind of get a sense of it, of what these kind of techniques look like and how they might differ from other forms of social science and humanities research as I go through our talk today. But just to note that these kinds of approaches are being taken up more broadly across USG. Notably, kind of usability.gov is a really valuable resource for how to incorporate some of these methods and approaches into your own work. There's groups like 18F, which is part of the GSA, that acts as kind of a service provider to other gov entities. My own sort of team at Co-Risk Labs and University of Toronto has done this kind of work on a number of sort of related projects. This is our first experience with USG, but we've done similar projects for places like the World Bank, the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, the World Resources Institute, and similar groups. So as I said, this is a 2-year project, and kind of following the lines of the usability.gov approach that you just saw, we kind of broke it up into 2 broad phases of work, roughly year 1 and year 2. of the project. So year one, phase one, was largely a discovery process where the goal was for our team and our designers to kind of develop a shared understanding of the design space, so the design context between themselves and as well as with NHC and our NOAA counterparts, and really surface a range of opportunities for some further work that could be pursued more deeply in phase two. And we're currently really in the thick of phase two. So today what I really want to focus on is to try to describe our process so far and highlight a couple of emerging insights. My goal is really just to give you all a sense of how these kinds of projects works, maybe encourage you to think about how an approach like this might fit in or not with some of the goals that you have. Our current plan is to deliver the final report and recommendations from this project more around kind of a July, August time period. So unfortunately, you'll have to wait until then for kind of a lot of the upshot of this work. So let's dive in. As I said with phase one, our goal, maybe unlike some of the social science projects and social science research you've seen in this space, is less about coming to kind of evidence-based arguments about how people in general need to receive and respond to the kinds of information that the National Hurricane Center puts out, but rather, again, to develop this kind of shared understanding of what is the design space around this problem and what are some emerging opportunities that we can then explore further in phase two. So I'll talk through this, but we did everything from a bunch of interviews with the NHC staff, as well as some risk communication experts. We looked deeply at the web analytics of the current site with some help of actually NHC and NOAA staff. We did a pretty solid lit review on tropical storm risk communication. We did something called a heuristic evaluation that I'll talk through, and then we did about 40 interviews with members of the general public. And so here you see a lot of different methods kind of being deployed and really being triangulated, again, to sort of map out, well, what are some possibilities here? What does the space look like? What are some key problems? What are the key user needs? And what are some opportunities for meeting them? So just kind of going through, I'm going to make these slides available as a handout afterwards because there's a lot of information on them, and I won't have time to go through all of them. But really the first thing that we did immediately upon starting the project was we just wanted to talk to a lot of folks around the National Hurricane Center and some other folks from NOAA who had a stake in some of these questions about hurricane risk communication to the public. We had some experience with kind of the website and the current set of social media tools. So we talked to about 13 people, and really, trying to understand kind of how they saw, the place of the site within the overall information ecosystem of hurricane risk during the run-up to storms. What was the history of the site? Where did it come from? Who were the sort of primary users up to then? And then as well as we convened a small group of experts who kind of provided us a little bit of a working group of people that had a lot of experience working in hurricane risk communication, doing either as academics or practitioners. And this was kind of a little bit of our brain trust to help us get up to speed quickly on some of the research that's already been done in this space to make sure that we weren't kind of going down any blind alleys or that kind of thing. And just to highlight some of the quick priorities from our conversations with the NHC team, these are kind of ordered and kind of by importance, at least in terms of how often they showed up in our interview transcripts. But I think just a couple of the main ones here at the top was the need to sort of organize the content better. There's a ton of information on the site right now if you go take a look, but it's not always obvious where to find what. And this was something we heard a lot. There's a strong interest from the NHC team about how to localize and personalize some of the information that's provided. Right now, a lot of the products are at a very kind of broad sort of geographic scale, and we know that sort of the impacts of hurricanes are very local and very particular. So what opportunities were there around that? There's a lot of, and if you look right now for this number 3, if you look right now at the kind of top menu bar of hurricanes.gov, it's very easy to sort of end up on a completely different part of the weather service or NOAA kind of web domain. And it can be very difficult for users to sort of figure out where they are within kind of this larger ecosystem how they get from one place to another. So this question about how do we navigate with sort of that ecosystem just within the Weather Service and partner sites was a big one. And you can read the rest. The next approach we took was, as I mentioned, just taking a sort of a deep dive into the web analytics, trying to understand how the current site was being used, what users were doing right now. And we got a lot of help from some NOAA and NHC team members, in particular Jessica Few and David Zielinski on this. Just to highlight a quick findings here. One of the things that we found really interesting was kind of a cluster of findings that I think point to something really interesting. And first was a sort of overall declining share of traffic, either from people moving from viewing the site from within a .gov domain, so other sort of federal employees, as well as a declining overall share of traffic from people that were just typing in hurricanes.gov directly. This corresponded to an increased share of traffic from search engines and social media as well. And what this tells us, again, is sort of this idea that the historic focus and emphasis on core partners, other parts of government, was really starting to be a little bit of a mismatch of who's actually spending time on the site. And with there being a lot more public attention to the site, we have a rise of first-time users who often don't read, who are often less motivated and less specific about what they think they need when they arrive on the site. So they often might not read the documentation. They don't spend as long on the site. If they don't quickly find what they're looking for, they're liable to leave. And in general, this has actually been pretty consistent, but both across this site, but just sort of the risk communication literature in general, is people like pictures. They are automatically drawn to the graphics, and they tend to look there first for the information. So here the cone of uncertainty is the most popular content on the site. It can be a little bit difficult to interpret, which raises some concern if we have people kind of going there and looking at it and then leaving without sort of the knowledge of sort of what exactly that graphic means, raises some concerns. So again, what we're seeing is more time and on the site by members of the public, a higher percentage of overall traffic by the general public, and this is part of the motivation for this work. Next, we did a lit review. Again, a lot of designers will come into a space and take kind of a very greenfield approach and try to sort of reinvent a lot of questions and findings based on their own work. We really, wanted to be sort of very cognizant and very aware that there's a ton of work done around best practices in hurricane risk communication already, and we wanted to find a way to draw on that as much as possible. So we had our team read over 60 articles, asking some really simple questions about sort of what are the specific decisions that the general public may be making in relationship to storm information, and what do they base those decisions on, and trying to view these through a lens of sort of how then could the site and the other web properties of NHC support this. Lit review themes, probably if you're familiar with this literature, will look very familiar to you. But what I think was cool that we did with this, and that I'm quite excited about, was we turned sort of the findings of that lit review into what we call a heuristic evaluation. Heuristic evaluation is an approach that the designers use all the time to quickly evaluate a site or some tools against some commonly used heuristics or design principles. Typically, when you're doing something like this, you kind of ask between 4 and 7 designers, take a set of heuristics or best practices, if that's easier, to then work independently and kind of, again, sort of evaluate a set of tools. Once they do that independently, you then convene a discussion amongst them that goes for an hour or two to just look for areas of agreement, disagreement, and kind of talk through what we found. And this is a really quick and cheap way to start to develop some expert consensus about where some real opportunities for improvement are. And so what we wanted to do was to turn all that work that we've done with the lit review into a novel set of heuristics for internet-based communication of our storm risk information. And so we combined the findings from that lit review along with some kind of just basic sets of heuristics that are already available for kind of UX and web design more broadly. And we convened, I think, 4 or 5 people to do this. And it was a really super interesting exercise. Here's an example of just kind of what one of these heuristics looks like. This one was just simply hurricane information should be communicated clearly and concisely. And then we had kind of a set of sort of sub questions under that helped each of the designers do the evaluation in a somewhat consistent process across each of the design experts. Here's another one around making sure that sort of we're orienting the kinds of information that we're providing and the way that we're providing it to kind of the specific tasks or decisions or actions that we want users to take as a result. Here's sort of an example of what one of the score sheets looked like. So the heuristic, this whole process was super useful, and we're excited not just about what we learned from it, but also from this opportunity for the heuristics that were created to maybe act as a baseline for any improvements or recommendations we would suggest as part of this project, but that also the NHC can take forward into their future endeavors in this space. Last, as I mentioned, we did a bunch of public interviews. Again, I think we talked to about 37, 38 people. Average length for about 30 to 40 minutes. We tried to focus on people who from New York, Houston, and New Orleans, and in North Carolina that had experienced a hurricane in one fashion or another. And the goal here was not so much to produce kind of generalizable knowledge or kind of scientific findings about people's experience of storms, so much as to generate kind of a bank of stories of individual kind of experiences of these events that we could then take into our design process. And designers call this, building empathy with users. And one way to do that is to understand kind of their stories, their experiences, and how these events affect them. So again, we came up with some key decisions that probably look familiar to anyone that has some background in this literature. We tried to also understand where they went for their information. I think maybe one thing just to note here in terms of information sources is very few members of the public mentioned going directly to hurricanes.gov or to the NHC website. What this tells us is that that's a really important design finding, because it means that people are often ending up, even with all that traffic that we noticed from people that we think are members of the public, it means that they're not ending up there directly or necessarily intentionally. And that really changes sort of how we need to present the information on the site. Any kind of contextual details or relevance we need to include alongside kind of the code of uncertainty or other important products. And then as well, really sort of highlights the importance of giving some of the information architecture of the site right, so people can quickly kind of orient themselves and find what they're looking for once they arrive. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Yeah, and as well as kind of we asked them some of their what are the trade-offs? How did they kind of choose which information sources to rely on when they're choosing kind of to weighing information they hear from their neighbors or friends over information that they hear on social media versus information that they heard on the news, which is what so many of the users that we interviewed mentioned was this kind of constellation of sources that they were always kind of navigating between. So each of those methods that I went through really quickly, we kind of, as I said, we sort of like triangulated between them, both to help our team and the NHC team kind of get on the same page in terms of sort of what the situation really was, but also we wanted to just surface a lot of opportunities or areas of future work that we could focus on in year 2. We initially came up with a list of 39, just pulling those individually from each of those methods that I mentioned. And as a team and through some conversations with the partners, we kind of narrowed those down to 11 across 3 categories. First, making NHC information more relatable and accessible to the public. Second was to kind of help understand and better situate hurricanes.gov and NHC social media presence within the broader risk information ecosystem, which is the part in which users are always trying to navigate. And then finally, just what are some simple things we could do right away in terms of sort of best practices in UX and web design that could be relevant for the NHC. And so we had a couple of conversations in August and September of last year where we kind of walked through each of these, and ultimately we decided on these four, focused on location, this integration with some of the regional forecast office sites that I'll talk about, information architecture review that I've already mentioned, and then this question of persona development, which I'll again introduce in a minute. But I think one thing that's cool is just how closely those design opportunities that we chose, map to some of the key things that came out of the NHC interviews in our early discussions with the team. And so that was some evidence to us early, about halfway through the project, that this goal of kind of establishing a shared understanding of the problem space between our teams during phase one was reasonably successful. Okay, so let's dive into phase two. And I'm gonna need to go through these relatively quickly. But as I said, these were all kind of four individual opportunities for future work that we had identified during phase one that we then selected in partnership with the NHC to really spend time on and go much deeper into during phase two. As I said at the top, we're still kind of in the middle of a lot of this work. So I'm gonna kind of present to you some of our approaches and some of the early decisions and findings we had. But again, this is much more of a process talk than I won't unfortunately be able to highlight any of our final recommendations because we're still working through those. So first off, personas and journey mapping. This was an interesting one and a bit of a challenge for us because a lot of the folks at the NHC were really excited about these ideas. However, these are typically kind of almost intermediate products. They're part of a design process. You kind of pull together a set of personas for your users, and they're kind of detailed, sort of fictional but realistic portrayals of who are these individuals that you imagine to be using your tools. What context do you imagine them using them in? What do we know about them, and what are they trying to accomplish when they are using your tools? And this is a way, again, of helping designers develop what they call empathy for the end user, help us put ourselves in their position and make better design decisions as a result. And here, this seemed to offer a lot of promise, in particular because with this focus on the public that we're considering pivoting towards, there's a lot of different groups in the public, right? And they have very different sort of, again, context of use, particular needs, relationships to the kinds of information that an NHC can make available. However, as I said, these are kind of intermediary tools. Designers create personas and they do what we call journey mapping, which is just essentially how a persona would travel through your application and accomplish their goal, as a way to make design decisions. They're not often something that we hand over to clients. So we had to get a little bit interesting, and we're really excited what we came up with. We came across, and this wasn't sort of our idea, but essentially this tool that had already been created by other designers, kind of for a very broad set of use, called Cards for Humanity, and it's just 2 decks of cards. And on the left, you have kind of some characteristics about a user. On the right, you have the context of use, and you kind of sort them randomly, and then you walk through how would that person in that particular context make the best use of our site. And so what we're doing now is going through all those user interviews, looking at the lit review that we did as part of phase 1, and pulling those together into a set of draft cards that we can then share with the NHC for some discussion. And so we've got, and we just think that this is going to be much more easy to use than a typical design persona that we would normally deliver to other designers. We think it can be easily updated and maintained. If certain cards are working, or not working, they can be dropped. If new sort of contexts or characteristics need to be considered, it can be easy to add them in. And allows us to bring in, user insights from a lot of different sources, as I said. And then so the idea would be we'd kind of deliver these 2 sets of cards. and then the NHC, when they're trying to make design decisions or have conversations about how to meet their users' needs, would then be able to walk them through a journey map. So we can talk more about that. I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards. The next thing that we talked about and the next sort of opportunity that we've been focusing our time on is just a general information architecture review, and I brought this up earlier. But the goal again is really to how to make it much easier and more intuitive for end users when they find themselves on the NHC site, whether going there directly, but increasingly going there through search results or social media. How can they quickly orient themselves and find what they're looking for? So we're starting with an approach that's called card sorting. And this is a way of helping designers understand kind of the mental models of users, or just put more simply, what users' expectations are for how different bits of content on a site would be organized, grouped together, or otherwise related together. And so we're using a tool called Optimal Workshop, which is a paid service. It's cool because it offers both the interface that allows you to do the card sorting, and I'll show that in a minute, but it also helps you recruit research participants. So it just kind of allowed us to kind of quickly take our project, set it up, find people to work on it. Here's a little bit what that interface looks like. Essentially what we did was we took, I think, about 30 pieces of content that we thought were the most relevant to public audiences, and had a conversation with NOAA and NHC to verify that, but then provided them kind of individually to users through Optimal Workshop, and asked them to group them together and to give each group a name. Normally, just to note, you would do this in person with kind of index cards or sticky notes or something like that. And a lot of the value of this is getting people to sort of talk about why they would put something in one group versus another, and just kind of externalize their thought process. That really helps. And in that case, you might do it with like just 5 or 6 people, and you can get a lot from that. Because we're forced to do all this research online, we decided to go for kind of a little bit of a larger sample size. I think we've done about 30 now, and we're starting to actually see some nice groupings and some things that seem useful. Just quickly, Optimal has some nice kind of visualizations and graphics once you've collected this data to explore it in different ways. I think in this one's particularly useful. So yeah, like I said, I think we've got about 30 of these now, and we're starting to see some useful groupings come together, but I think we're still reviewing these and trying to make some decisions about sort of some next steps with this line of work could be. There's other kinds of card sorts that might be useful. There's other kinds of information architecture research that might be useful. So this is in process. Next, as I mentioned earlier, a big focus of our conversation with the team has been around kind of location-specific information, and how could we orient a user's experience of the site and of the NHC web presence around us. And so what we did here is a different kind of method, where we just got some experts together, both designers and risk communication folks. We had about 8 in our group. And here we used a different online tool. This one's called Miro, that acts as a shared virtual whiteboard. And we gave our experts just the challenge of designing a website or an app that would present hyper-local hurricane risk information to the public. And we had kind of 2 days over which we sort of walked them through kind of some discussions about end users, some findings from hurricane risk information literature, and had them kind of quickly do some prototyping, give each other feedback, iterate on their own concepts. And what we're going for here, importantly, is not so much like a perfect solution that we could then say, here's what you should adopt, NHC, but instead the goal was to, again, kind of go broad and surface a bunch of design concepts or ideas in this space, and then think with some other designers and risk communication experts about them as a way of kind of increasing our own set of tools or palette that we would bring to the next stages of the design process. So we took these ideas into some pretty low fidelity mock-ups that we then used to structure another round of user interviews, which we're kind of in the thick of now. Again, we would normally do this in person with what's called a think aloud method, where we ask people to, again, kind of externalize or verbalize what they're working on and what they're trying to do when they click on different parts of the site. Often we'll use just hand-drawn versions of these mockups and encourage people to kind of scribble all over them, cross things out, add new sections of the site, etc. And so we ended up having to innovate a little bit or just do things quite differently as a result of social distancing and everything moving online. I guess the point I want to make here is this is quite different from UI testing, where the goal is to really evaluate the performance of a high fidelity prototype. Here again, we wanted to get kind of just a more general sense from users about what kinds of localized information would be most valuable, some of their expectations for how it might be presented, to offer some more kind of higher level guidance to the NHC team than, again, kind of a finished mock-up, because that wasn't the mandate of the project. Last quickly, because I'm running low on time and want to save some time for discussion, the fourth opportunity that we've talked about is sort of increased integration with sort of regional tropical web pages that actually has quite a bit more of the kinds of local information, as you can see here, than the NHC currently does. And right now there's this question about what the relationship should be between NHC.gov and some of these regional sites that have this really valuable, more granular local risk and particular impact information, as well as links to kind of local preparedness resources and so on. So here we're just kind of having some conversations with the team. We're trying to sort of, and basically the goal here is to sketch out a couple of different options for how this relationship might work, what some of the pros and cons might be, and so on. And that's the fourth opportunity that we're looking at. So just quickly, as a way of wrapping up, here's some initial insights from what we're finding from the project so far. And again, I mentioned this already, but when we open, perhaps unsurprisingly, but when we move away from this kind of historic focus on expert communities who are highly motivated to come to the NHC website, that know exactly what they're looking for when they arrive, and who the NHC has put a lot of effort in over the years to developing strong relationships with and gotten a lot of feedback from over the years. When we move away from that and think about shifting towards meeting the needs of a general public, we immediately encounter there's just an incredible diversity of user needs and preferences for how they would receive that information that all of a sudden needs to be taken into account. So the problem space immediately becomes much more complicated. Second, there is, as I've kind of talked about, there is a pretty dense ecosystem of USG sites, but also other sites that are kind of in some ways competing with, in other ways complementary to what the National Hurricane Center has on offer. And this is really forcing us, and I think will continue to force us to think about designing at more of an ecosystem type level, which is very different from how we would normally approach kind of designing a single artifact or a single tool. And so that's been interesting and challenging in all sorts of ways. Third, there's a bit of a mismatch that the NHC is very well aware of between kind of what risk communication experts say that users need in terms of kind of very actionable, localized information about impacts, and with what NHC as a USG organization with very particular mandates and very strong expertise in a particular area is really set up to deliver. And so that's kind of, I think, ties to this challenges of designing an ecosystem level, but makes it so that there's not a clear crosswalk between the findings of hurricane risk communication and how the NHC should respond. So that presents some interesting and challenges as well. And then finally, on maybe less of on the challenge side of things, and more on the positive side of things is that good design is going to help all users, right? There's a lot of sort of simple and small improvements that we're seeing that will get the current NHC web presence kind of up to speed with contemporary best practices and heuristics for user experience design on the web. And that's going to help every user, not just, and so there's not always this kind of trade-off between sort of what the experts need versus the general public. And so there's a lot of opportunities that we're seeing just to meet those in ways that'll help everyone. Couple more sort of process reflections. Talking to this kind of work is faster, cheaper, and I think more valuable than widely understood. A lot of these methods in the design world, we call them discount because they're kind of quick, dirty. There's many designers that will tell you can just learn a ton by talking to just 5 or 6 different people about what you're trying to accomplish and what their goals are. And it doesn't require a ton of expertise to do that and to learn useful things about from adopting some of these approaches. Second, we were really lucky, and it was a little bit, we had maybe some miscommunications towards the front of this project of just about how open-ended and kind of iterative the project design has been. We really started from a place of we want to spend the first year just figuring out what the design space is, and let's develop a shared understanding of that. That's very different from some of the other projects that have been funded under this mechanism that came in with like very specific research questions and a very specific approach how they're going to answer those questions. This was a much more open-ended, iterative process that's turned out to be really valuable, but took a little bit of trust and faith in us to be able to pull off. And then third, we really, one of the takeaways that we want to really hammer home in some of our final recommendations and provide some guidance on how to do is that this kind of work, just given the changing nature of technologies, the changing nature of the risk information ecosystem more generally, this is a kind of thing that requires and really benefits from sustained investment and seeing kind of incorporating kind of a culture or a process of design within kind of longer term decision-making structures about the site. So I'll wrap up there. As I said, we're kind of just wrapping up some of our research into each of these opportunities, starting to synthesize our findings and communicate them in a range of different ways to NOAA and the NHC. One question, I mentioned a couple examples at the top, but I would be really interested in the Q&A or follow up over email if people have other experience doing this kind of work in USG. What are some of the challenges, obstacles, or kind of success stories from incorporating human-centered design into the various agencies? I'd love to hear more about that. As I said, this is our first time working with USG. So I'll stop there. My contact information along with Scott's are up on the screen, and I apologize I went a little bit over, but excited to hear your questions.
Thanks, Robert. We do have questions here. Just as a reminder, you can add questions in the question panel or in the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can. Any that we don't get to will be emailed to the presenters, and they can follow up with you. So our first question is, how large is your UX team? Can you describe the breakdown of UX researchers to UX designers?
Yeah, that's a great question. Our team has actually changed a bit in composition over the 2 years of the project. Year 1, we were, I think, focused a little bit more on people with strong kind of interviewing and literature review skills, as again, we were kind of focused on sort of that side of it. Year 2, we brought on a couple of more folks that have done kind of more UX design. So the team has been shifting. I think overall there's been about 7 or 8 of people that have kind of come through at one point or another. The bulk of those people have been really focused on user research. We have now just two designers on the team that are really thinking about ways to kind of translate the findings of that user research into some design ideas.
Okay, for the card sorting exercise, did you consider doing a moderated session so you could get the think aloud comments from the participants?
Yes, and we're actually still considering that as well. As I mentioned, there's a couple of other options for card sorting. One is called a closed sort, which is where you sort of give the users the categories ahead of time, and then you just ask them to sort the content into those buckets. As I said, this was a bit of an experiment for us to try and do it online and to do it with a larger user sample size than we normally would. I think one of our possible next steps very well could be something over Zoom, where we just kind of use a Miro board and give people a couple of cards and ask them to move around, and then do the kind of think aloud method that you're describing. Absolutely.
Can you talk more about the decision process that ended up with a lower priority for mobile first and accessibility?
Yeah, that's a great question. Those were two things that I personally ranked pretty high in our first set of opportunities. But I think my sense is that there are some broader questions that the NHC came to us about. Just should we be focused on the public at all? What should our relationship be to the regional forecast sites that are maybe a little bit, I think, more broad? Certainly, any recommendations that we offer would be to design in a mobile-friendly way. We actually did a review of the site currently, how it works on mobile platforms, and it's not great. And as well, sort of accessibility is something that I'm pretty passionate about. But I think those are kind of a little bit more kind of specific questions, and we were kind of brought in, I think, again, at a slightly more broader level. Would be how I would explain it.
So I can add, like, in just terms of like bare bones process, you know, we tried to iterate on this quite a bit. So there's 2 rounds of kind of prioritizing within the team. Don't remember how many folks that was. Then we brought it to the leadership group for the grant at NOAA, which I think was 6. They ranked them, and I think eliminated a few to get us to 11. And then we went to a much larger group. I don't remember, Gina, if you can recall the attendance, but probably in the 25 range. So they provided their input on prioritizing. And then we went back to the leadership group. So it was 5 rounds of iteration. So regardless of the reasons, which is what Robert was getting at, we felt fairly confident that the number of folks we involved in discussing and prioritizing those original 36, 39 design opportunities, you know, obviously we would love to pursue more, but we felt that they were fairly important and got good feedback.
Yeah, this is Gina. I really appreciate both of your responses. Let me be clear to our audience that we thought all 39 were important. This was really, really challenging. We had to really think about where the funding was coming from these as related to the disaster supplementals and focusing a bit more on that content. But please don't see that as a disregard or lack of importance of the other topics. It gives us space to know that there are future steps in the near term that we would love to take given the opportunity.
Okay, our next question. Did you look to the US design standards as a possible design system to help promote consistency on the platform?
Great question. Again, I think that is perhaps a little bit more, I want to say lower level than our mandate on this project. We do think, but it is that kind of approach is something that we consider to be one of the very kind of near-term things that a designer or a team of designers could be brought in to do that would have very quick wins, just in terms of modernizing the look and feel of the site and then developing some consistency across the different parts of the site. And so that will certainly be one of our recommendations, but again, I think a little bit more lower level than a lot of the the opportunities that we were asked to pursue in this phase 2.
Yeah, if I can add more, I think it's important to make a distinction, and it maybe is not easy, both in terms of people's unfamiliarity with this kind of work, and also the fact that, like, Robert and I have feet in both spaces, but this is a research project, not a design project. So the approach to the research we refer to as research through design. So by actively designing, you're researching your understanding of the design space, in this case, hurricanes.gov, where, as Robert was talking about, like meeting requirements and specifications, laws in this case, that would be much more of a design responsibility. And we'll definitely touch on that, like Robert said, in recommendations of things that people have to be aware of, because some of the findings of the research through design might not be compatible with rules and regulations. But again, the project was a research project, not so much a design project, not specifically a design project.
Okay, can you talk about your general recommendations for how hurricanes.gov should integrate access to satellite imagery in support of their efforts?
Great question. We don't have any specific recommendations on that as of yet. What I can say is that imagery is very popular on the site, in terms of, if you look at the web analytics. As I mentioned earlier, people like pictures. It's one of the more kind of sought out bits of content beyond some of the kind of flagship products like the Cone of Uncertainty and key messages and so on. Right now, we're trying to, as part of the IA review, we're trying to sort of figure out how best, sort of where to put that and how to relate it to some of the other content. But we don't have any strong general recommendations on it at the moment. If this is something you know about and are passionate about, I'd love to chat. My email is right there.
Okay, we have a comment here. We have hit on these same exact issues working within a test bed environment. Our grants in particular have struggled with traditional academic reviewers that don't have experience with this kind of method and purview. Do you have recommendations for working that side, helping more traditional social science academics understand the need for and value of this work?
That's a wonderful question. I'd love to, yeah, please drop me an email. I'd love to chat with you about your experience. I'm curious, actually, as I said at the beginning, we did struggle a little bit to kind of communicate this to the broader team. I wonder if Scott or even Gina might want to weigh in on that instead of me, as I came in this project a little later.
You weren't the one pissing everyone off. Yeah, I mean, to like more specifically, what we're actually, I mean, I can talk about that a little bit, but that is such an important question, and you're right that it is so kind of such a new development in the research and R2O space that we're talking about, and I don't think Gina and Jen and Jessica know this, but we're gonna put together a case study of basically the meta process of all this. Now we're trying to bring research through design into the NOAA design space, or maybe Gina, Jen, and Jessica will decide that's a bad idea, but that's the point of the case study, to basically kind of deliberate on the question you have. But I think Robert hit on a primary reason where most traditional research projects are, show up beautifully on a Gantt chart, and you can time it out, and exactly the methods that you're going to use, and what it's going to look like at the end, because there's so many past projects that you could point to in other spaces that would be similar, where we really had to present a framework. And so I think, yeah, that pushback is you all aren't being specific enough. And so it's we're pointing to the tools rather than the plan. And that, it's just like the question stated, it's just not a common approach. Gina?
Yeah, I'll jump in too. This has been what a great question and what a really thoughtful set of answers. I think we struggle sometimes with balancing, not struggle, but balancing, right? The need for having good theory surrounding our methods around a certain question or problem. And traditionally we call that research. On the physical science side, we often use the phrase R&D, research and development. And development is often a word we use in relation to building out technology and sort of that space for the messy space. You're not ready for a contract to build out perhaps a software yet because you don't know exactly what that software is going to look like or that tool is going to look like. You want some development space that's still sort of akin to research. It's like a sibling of it, right? But it's not that pure research. And I think much the same that technology, that's hardware, needs that space, so too does human factors and usability. And I think this project and the test beds, as the participant attendee asked, I think is really indicative of needing that development space in the social sciences, making sure that we have space to bring in humans and the interaction with things, be it a website, be it a software, so forth, so on. So I think we should continue this discussion. I think this is a really great question.
And to add more just at a higher level, so I was almost 25 years ago, I was started as a federal scientist at the USGS. By the time I left, I had really started shifting my perspective as being this designer and needing to have users participate in the design of things, even including like physical models. And so that actually wound up being both my last project at the USGS and my PhD project of doing participatory modeling, where of course, the old geologists and geophysicists was like, no, you got to use first principles. But I'm like, yeah, but these eventually get used. And so you should bring people in as soon as possible because you will use first principles, you'll use your physics, but you do need direction, and that needs to be set in the beginning and then continuously through. And I'm happy to say, like, it's kind of gone in fits and starts at the USGS, but they're still continuing to kind of take some of those approaches in a very narrow way. So, I mean, I think it's something that multiple agencies and multiple kind of industries are both accepting and struggling with, but I think it should be used more broadly, like Gina said.
All right, I think this is going to be our last question today. Most people download and use apps. Much of the information is available through different apps. How do we prevent losing all of these customers without having an official NOAA, NHC, or NWS app that users can download, use, and count on?
Great question.
Yeah,
you want to jump in?
I wonder on the federal side, what I can say is it's a tricky question due to standing public-private partnerships that we have. So I'll just put that out there for consideration. But Robert, want to give you an opportunity to respond as well.
Yeah, I think.
Robert, if you want, I'll go for it.
No, go ahead, Scott. I've talked enough.
Oh, I was going to say, just as an example of thinking about like the journey mapping and one particular insight that we pointed out that a lot of folks don't go there directly, which would be kind of an app like use case study, but instead they find themselves there. For example, I remember one story from someone I interviewed. They really looked to see that by clicking all the way through, they eventually wound up at hurricanes.gov because that provided the trust, because it was a source of authority that they wouldn't otherwise have. So if they saw a news story and you couldn't do 3 degrees of Kevin Bacon to get to hurricanes.gov, they might have less trust in that information. And it might be exactly the same in terms of how you navigate a commercial app. So that would just be an example of understanding the journey and then the role that hurricanes.gov might play in that. It may not be as apparent as how you use an app.
Okay, that is all we have time for today. If we didn't get to your question, I will be forwarding those to the speakers so they can follow up with you. Thank you to all of our speakers today. Thank you all for joining us. You will be able to find this presentation on YouTube later this afternoon. When the presentation ends, you will see a survey. If you could take time to fill that out, we do use these surveys to improve marketing our library seminar service and to inform future seminar topics. Thank you again for joining us. Have a safe and enjoyable rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.